Well, today on the show, we have author and theologian and professor Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, how are you today?
I'm good. I've never been called a theologian, so thank you for that. That's great.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Chuck, you have just written a book called "When Narcissism Comes to Church,"
hmm
and I read that as a pastor and as a church planter, and so many things in there just rang true. You are giving voice in that book to so many things that I think a lot of people are beginning to talk about, to verbalize. We see the results of fruit where it's gotten us so far. Chuck, what promoted you? What motivated you to write that book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I did not want to write this book at all.
Okay.
I was anxious about it, in part because it's a hard conversation, in part because I need to deal with some of my own egocentricity, um, in part because it just felt like a more kind of a diagnostic book rather than something that I'd written a few books before that, and the previous one was called Wholeheartedness, and that felt like it came more from the depths of my own heart and story as a pastor and as a therapist. But this came from pastors. It was really motivated by pastors who I'd either worked with as a, in my role as a therapist, or I'd consulted for in a church setting. And pastors were the ones who said to me, "Hey, could you write something that would give us a kind of diagnostic that explains narcissism in the church, that would help us understand maybe a hopeful way forward, and not just paint a really dim and ugly picture, a book that would take the pastoral vocation seriously while at the same time calling us to more." So that felt like a pretty hefty challenge, but that's really what motivated it was pastors.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so let's just ask the question that I know you get asked a lot. What is narcissism?
Yeah, well, so a number of things go into it, but I think you can probably boil it down to three characteristics: grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, and a lack of empathy. I actually get into the book and I get into 9 different faces of narcissism, and I complexify it from there. But there's a basic sense of grandiosity. In other words, there's sort of an addiction to an image of themselves that is bigger and better and stronger and faster than how they really feel about themselves, or who they really are. There's a sense of entitlement. I deserve that. I deserve a large church. I deserve fame. I deserve your applause. I deserve all the titles and all the acclamations that I get. And then finally, there's this lack of empathy, which is really this sense of that they can't connect at a deep level to another human being, in part because they can't connect to their own pain, their own story. And so many who test on the narcissistic spectrum actually are curious about psychology, and they may even be winsome or personable, but most folks notice that they can't really connect at a deep level.
Okay.
And in relationship with a true blue narcissist, you don't really know them or feel known by them.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you talk about at the book, we referenced it at the beginning. You specifically in the book talk about how you've seen this a lot in church planting,
Yeah.
ministry world, especially in church planting.
Yeah.
How has that crept its way into the church planting world?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. And it feels like a big conversation to me, because some of this gets at um, the motivation behind church planting. Some of it gets at the metrics of church planting and what we consider successful church planters or unsuccessful churches or church planters. In my experience, and so I was in the church planting world. I'm not so much in it now, but I was in it for a good 15, 18 years in my own work as a pastor and in various circles. And one of the first things I noticed in my work was that a number of the assessments, not all the assessments, but some of the assessments that I was working with on an assessment team, some of the things that they expected a planter to be kind of lined up with some of the definitions of narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
They would talk about a gatherer, an influencer, someone who's inspiring, someone who can command attention, someone who isn't easily thrown off his game. You know, all these different things that I thought, wow, those are, I mean, what I'd want to see in a pastor is vulnerability, honesty, transparency, strength, but strength that is born out of a kind of Pauline sense of strength and weakness, you know. But some of the gifts and inventories and assessments actually set planters up for trouble. It practically invited church planters who are narcissistic. And so, but I think there are other aspects to it. I think the independence of it, I don't have to be as accountable as I might be in some other setting. I think that sense that of competition that I see in a lot of church, but I've got some really good friends who are church planters, and there is this sense of I gotta get at it every day, you know, or else this may be my last day, you know, or there are these other churches in the city that I'm competing against. So there's almost like a capitalist spirit in some church planters, you know. And so, I mean, there's so much more we can say about it, but those are just some things that come to mind.
Yeah. And would you say it's not just limited, that kind of mindset, it's not just limited to church planters, that just spread, that's across the board.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in the academic world now for 7 years teaching at a seminary, and I see that some of the same kinds of competition and comparison, ego, and hierarchy, and all the different kinds of things in my world. And I don't think this is about a particular vocation as much as it is about our human hearts and our proclivity toward egocentricity. And I often say that Adam and Eve grasped, and we've been grasping ever since. Adam and Eve hid, and we've been hiding ever since. And so this is a long-term phenomenon.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought of when I read your book, and then even as I hear you talk about it, is, would you say that we've almost built the ministry system, particularly here in America in the West, that we've almost built the system of ministry on the back of narcissism?
I'm afraid what you're saying is true. Okay. I think in part because I think we've been swimming in the narcissistic waters for a lot longer than the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. I mean, I think it's sort of baked into the cake of a kind of Western American ethos. But I even think it goes further than that. You know, I often say that when Constantine saw the sign of the cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer," you know, and the sign of the cross, conquer, go to war, win. I think we've been dealing with this as a church ever since. And you've seen it in the history of popes and prelates and priests. You see it in kind of the American spirit of the church, that spirit of church growth, kind of the veneration of the megachurch pastor, the influencer, with all the followers on social media. So there really is an idolatry of success and relevance, power, ego.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when you're talking about looking for, you know, Pauline leadership qualities, you know, strength out of weakness and those kind of things, are those kind of things that we even want anymore in ministry leaders, it seems?
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder sometimes. And I know that, you know, in certain pockets, and I'm sure you know in certain pockets, there are beautiful examples of pastors who are leading
absolutely
in very quiet and very ordinary ways, you know. And I think ordinary has become an important word to me, you know, because I think pastors sometimes fear being ordinary. I fear being ordinary, you know, but when I say they're pastoring in very ordinary ways, I mean, they're baptizing, and they're weeping with those who weep and laughing with those who laugh. And they're doing a lot of this behind the scenes, and they don't have a big following on Instagram. And that's what they've been called to do, to preach, to baptize, to serve, to disciple, to pray, to counsel. And so I do think there are many pastors who are kind of living out of that deep sense of the pastoral vocation. But I do think that there are many others who've been enticed by this sort of spirit of success, popularity, power, relevance, that's so pervasive nowadays.
Yeah. Do you think that those church leaders, and like you said, there are many out there, those church leaders that they're not pursuing, all of those things. They're just, the ordinariness, if you will, of ministry. Do you think that they are intentionally fighting against the stream there to stay in that kind of mentality?
To stay in the mentality of kind of being an ordinary pastor.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're always fighting against your own need to be great, your own need. I mean, I was talking to a pastor the other day who's actually a doctor of ministry student of mine, and he's a church planter whose church probably hasn't grown more than 150. And I said something like that. Yeah, that's 5 or 10 times the size of the early church, the house churches,
Yeah.
But in his mind, I don't have a social media following. I'm not being invited to speak at conferences. I'm not the example of how to do a church and do it right, and so he's fighting constantly his own shame. And he's actually writing for his doctor of ministry work on shame and how pastors battle with shame. And I think that's so important for us to recognize that underneath our egocentricity is a lot of shame. We want to be seen. We want to be known. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, I think we long for God to know, to see, to love us, to care for us. But then we go looking for it in other kinds of ways too.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that you talk about, this isn't just limited to mega churches. It's not just limited to even the church growth camp, is it?
No, it's not. I talk about small churches. I talk about 2 different kinds of narcissism in people and in systems: grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. And vulnerable is kind of a strange word. It's a word that psychologists use, but it's really the flip side. It's a less grand version of narcissism. I'll give you an example because it makes more sense with an example. Take a church. I'm thinking of a church in the Midwest that is in a small town, and they believe they are the faithful church. No one is more true to the gospel. No one has stood up against the forces of culture better than they have. That church down the road, and this church, and the Methodists, and the Presbyterians, and this, that, and the other, they've all fallen away. But we are the true church, and that's yet another form of idolatry, narcissism. But it doesn't come in the package of grandiosity. It doesn't have the kind of the lights and the big stage of the mega church.
Yeah. So what are some ways, is that going to be one of the primary ways that this might show up in the small, medium-sized churches is, hey, we're the faithful ones? Are there other ways that this might show itself there?
Yeah. I mean, I think it always comes in the form of comparison or competition. Like I do think when, and I can say this because I've seen this in my own story, my own heart over the years, where you're always kind of looking at the church down the road and you hear that pastor is doing a sermon series on Philippians, but we're doing a sermon series on the book of Revelation. And our series is just a whole lot more relevant to what's going on today. And we're comparing, and we're competing, and we're better. We're really thinking about these things more in more culturally relevant and appropriate ways than they are. And it can sort of crawl in subtle ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the pastor is narcissistic personality disorder. I think it just means that we're all prone to egocentricity, and we've got to sort of guard our hearts, as Scripture says.
Yeah. One of the things you referenced a moment ago is how you talk about how narcissism is really hidden in shame. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Where does that shame come from? What's it centered on? Unpack that a little bit.
So I mean, when I think about it theologically and biblically, I think it goes all the way back to the very beginning. And I think about it not in terms of, when Adam and Eve grasped the fruit, they realized that they were naked and they were ashamed. I think it goes even before that, when the serpent slithers up to them and says something to the effect of, surely God hasn't told you that you can't take from the fruit of that tree. If you take of that fruit, you'll know good and evil. Like the serpent is appealing to some sort of scarcity in them, some sort of lack. And shame is fundamentally about a sense of maybe there's something missing in me. Maybe there's something deficient. Maybe I'm not enough as God made me. So I think even if you kind of dial it back even into the, into the creation story and into that first interaction with Adam and Eve, we see that there's always an appeal to a sense of, maybe you've heard this before, but maybe my podcast isn't as good as the others. If only I do this for my podcast, if only I do that for my church, if only I implement this new program, then I'll be. And there's fundamentally this sense of scarcity, deficiency, not enoughness that is really core to a shame story. And so, I feel it in an academic setting where I've got colleagues who have PhD degrees from like Yale and Princeton and Harvard and all these different schools. And mine is from like a third tier kind of distance learning school, right? And I have this sense of, well, I don't belong here. I'm kind of the guy that they tolerate here at the seminary. And there's a sense of shame there,
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
So does that shame, does that come from mainly, obviously, our fallen nature?
Yeah.
And you talk about this a little bit in the book, something that an incident that might have happened when we were a child, younger, something in our life.
Yes.
Both of those things, or those issues?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing me back to your original question, because I think you're right on. Yeah. I think you're right on. I mean, I think we're born into a world that is broken, right? And as much as our parents long to care for us well and bond with us and give us the security we need, I do think that there's a point in which we sort of wake up, and I don't know, it happens at various ages, but we sort of wake up to the fact that Jimmy has something I don't have, or, I don't have a dad, but Bob has a dad, or whatever it might be. We wake up to a sense of deficiency. When we're a newborn, we're the apple of our mom's eye, we're just loved and we're held. And I feel like that's the Garden of Eden before the fall, and then we wake up one day and we realize, oh, there's pain in the world. There's this old 17th century pastor named George Herbert. He was also a poet. And he once said, I cried when I was born, and every day shows why. And I think he's referring to the brokenness of the world, that as much goodness as there is, and as hard as our parents work to love us, there's a fundamental sense of deficiency. Now, add on top of that stories of neglect, stories of abuse, stories of pain, stories of bullying. For me, when I think about it, I think my dad wasn't around a whole lot when I was growing up. He's a great dad, but he worked a lot. I got bullied by some older guys on my block, and then I got bullied by some older kids in middle school. And so I always had this fundamental sense that you're no good, Chuck. There's something wrong with you. They see it. Everyone must see it. There's something inherently wrong with you. And I wish I could tell you at 50 years old that has gone away. But even with therapy and spiritual direction and good pastoring in my life, I mean, that's still there.
Yeah.
Even though I know Jesus calls me the beloved, that's still there. And so I look for it in other ways. Affirm me, Mark, people buy my books so that I can feel good about myself. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does a church leader discover what that is? Maybe there's a church leader and they don't even realize it. They are working out of that sense of deficiency, but they don't even know that that's what they're working out of. How can we discover what that is?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I think it happens in a number of different ways. I think that there are people who simply do the work of self-understanding, self-knowledge, this is actually a deep part of the Christian tradition, to know oneself. I think there are people who are inclined to do that kind of work. I think sometimes it takes some suffering in our lives. There's a miscarriage, a marriage problem, a loss of a job, something hard that happens where we say, so what do I need to learn from that? Or what do I need to look at in that? I think that sometimes it comes in and through doubts. I grew up in a really certain tradition, and I thought I knew everything that there was to know about God, but now I've gone to seminary and my professors have introduced some things about the Bible or about how things unfolded that are making me start to question now, and I'm not sure. Sometimes it's just age. Sometimes we just grow up and we get to middle age, and it's sort of like, I thought I was climbing the ladder and I thought I'd find myself feeling pretty good once I planted that church or wrote that book or whatever it is. And we don't. And then we've got to begin to do the work of asking the question, so what is it? Why does my heart ache so deeply? Why do I feel so lonely? I thought writing a book would get me the approval. I thought being ordained would get me the approval. I thought getting married would help me to feel less lonely, and I don't. That's when the work begins in earnest.
Yeah. Can you talk about what that work might look like? So here it is.
Yeah.
I discovered it. What is the work?
Yeah. You ask really good questions. Yeah, the work can take on a number of different looks or faces or dimensions, I suppose. I mean, I think immediately what comes to mind for me, and one of the hats I wear is the hat of a therapist. And there's a kind of a deep dive that we can do into our own life stories. And we can begin to connect the dots of our story to ask, so, what needs were met and what needs went unmet? And where do I have to grieve? And where do I have to have honest conversations? How does that stream of alcoholism in my family affect me now that every night in the midst of my anxiety, I'm having 2 or 3 bourbons, all those kinds of questions that a good therapist can ask. But I think good spiritual directors can ask questions. I think good friends, being in good, honest friendships where you can ask those kinds of questions. A good pastor in your life who will invite you, or pastoral mentor who will invite you to begin to do that work of looking at your own life. And I guess one of the things I want to say to your listeners is that, especially those who might be skeptical about therapy, this is deep in the Christian tradition, not therapy necessarily, but this idea of looking at ourselves, self-knowledge. There was a Presbyterian pastor named John Flavel in the 17th century who once said, there are some women and men who go 30 or 40 years of life without having any discourse with their hearts all the while. Richard Baxter wrote a 300-page plus tome called The Mischiefs of Self-Ignorance and the Benefits of Self-Acquaintance. And so I want to say that it's really important for us to have this discourse with our hearts. Why am I sad? Why am I lonely? Why am I constantly comparing myself to the other pastor, the other podcaster, the other author, the other church planter?
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned earlier, talking about the narcissistic spectrum, the spectrum of narcissism. Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism?
Yeah, another good question. And I would say yes. Psychologists talk about healthy narcissism as, and the word narcissism is what throws people off, but they're really talking about healthy self-confidence, a healthy sense of self-esteem, you might say, or a healthy sense of one's own self, one's own boundaries, who they are. So I'll give you an example. Healthy narcissism. My daughter at 5, 6 years old back in the day, learns to do cartwheels, and she says eventually, Daddy, look at me, I'm doing cartwheels. There's a healthy sense of, look at me, Dad, be proud of me. Yeah. I don't look at her and say, that's selfish, that's idolatry, daughter, that's narcissism. Now if someone's doing that then at 55 years old, saying, congregation, look at me, look at what a great preacher I am, I think that's a problem. I think that's an unhealthy narcissism.
Yeah. But it's easy to do that now, isn't it? You can do that now in really subtle ways. Just post all these things online.
Yes.
And that's really what I'm saying.
Yes, that's it. And I do it. Maybe you do it. I mean, I think you have to have a certain amount of self-awareness. And I do notice sometimes I've had some friends who will kind of go through cycles on social media where they'll post a lot and then they'll say, I really need a break. This is too much. And what they'll discover, and I think what I've discovered over time, is that you have to understand what motivates that. Every time we tweet, every time we post, every time we preach, every time we go fishing for approval, there's something that's motivating this. And by the way, that doesn't make you narcissistic personality disorder. I think it makes you human, but it does require you to ask the question, so what's going on inside my heart? And 9 out of 10 times when someone's having that inner conversation in a healthy way, I know that they're probably not narcissistic personality disorder.
Okay. Yeah, I think you just answered my next question, because I was curious, how can I know if my motives are in the right place? Am I just feeding the false self, wanting to, narcissistic, build my kingdom or God's kingdom? how can I know the difference there? I think you just kind of went there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I would also say that, I was talking to a guy the other day who said, is every megachurch pastor a narcissist? And I said, no.
No. Yeah.
I think that there are probably many who don't operate fundamentally out of a place of shame, but out of a place of deep delight as God's beloved, and they're able to get up and speak confidently and lead courageously because they know they are the beloved of God. And then there are still others who have all kinds of secrets and all kinds of pain, and that shame is jet fuel for their achievement orientation, their perfectionism, and their dogmatism. And so one of the things I often say is that in the psychological world, we understand that there's a spectrum. Narcissism isn't you either have it or you don't have it. It's a spectrum. And there are those who have a kind of narcissistic characteristics or style. There are some who might be called narcissistic type, where you see some more definitive features, but then still further down the spectrum, there are others who are narcissistically disordered, which is more of a pervasive pattern of relating in a particularly narcissistic way that is a problem. So there's a spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the things that you've referenced a lot is self-awareness.
Yeah.
But you don't hear that talked about a lot among church leaders and that sort of thing. Is that almost something that we need to rediscover the art of self-awareness?
Yeah. I think, I think that there have been some really good, there's been some really good work in the last 10 or 20 years in and around this, but it's not, it might not be all that visible to some. I'm thinking more recently of someone like Pete Scazzero. Pete and his wife, Jerry Scazzero, produced some really good resources and helpful resources. I think a generation before, Henry Nouwen talked often about the wounded healer and the brokenness that we bring to ministry. I think there have been voices throughout the way. I think Eugene Peterson was a healthy voice calling us to be unnecessary and ordinary pastors, I do think that there are pockets of this here and there, and I know near you in Louisville, Rich Plass and Jim Cofield run the Soul Care Institute out there, and they do a great job of training pastors, inviting them to this inner conversation. And so I look around and I see a bunch of people doing this, but they're pretty under the radar most of the time.
Yeah. And so if somebody wants to go on this journey, almost they've got to do some work to try to find it.
I think so, because it's not yet normalized, and we're still seeing. I mean, as much as I think we made some progress, I'm actually seeing and hearing of more cases of narcissistic leaders. I'm hearing about more suicides this year of men in particular who've been caught in affairs and just feel like, well, I can't. That's it. I can't go on any longer. I mean, I've heard such dark stories, even in the past 6 months, that as soon as I think that we're making some headway, I'm immediately brought back to this sense of we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. So is there a way that a church leader can experience quote unquote success and not dive into narcissism, not feed that?
Yeah. And this is where the work that I've done is not a book against success or anything like that. I do think we need to kind of redefine that, but I love to celebrate, the successes, the small successes of, the pastor who, put together an event to get some members of the community out, and some new folks from the trailer park down the way came, and it's not going to be publicized on Twitter, but it was a really good event, and some people were invited in to a new way of understanding and knowing who Jesus is and the hospitality of Jesus. I want to celebrate the small things and not just the big things, and I think that we're so addicted to great that we've lost sight of the good in a like beatitude way, the sense of flourishing. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the brokenhearted, those who've come to the end of themselves. I mean, I want to celebrate people who've come to the end of themselves, as people who are living courageously in this world and are moving through the wildernesses of their lives into new freedom. Not just the stories of churches who are kind of like on up into the right trajectories.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it seems as if to really get at this issue, we're going to have to start to almost build the house all over again, in a sense of, like you just referenced, redefining success,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Would you agree with that? And if so, what could that even look like?
Yeah. This is where you and I, have to like spend 2 more hours together or something, because I do think that in the United States, and I'll try to be as efficient as possible in this, like in my words. I do think in the United States, the white church is in decline. We know that numerically. There's a season of decline, disorientation, you might say. Number of pastors who are asking questions, why aren't people coming back to church? A number of them even asking post-COVID, will they come back to church? And so I do think we're in a season of disorientation. And Phyllis Tickle, a number of years ago, wrote a book called The Great Emergence, where she said that about every 500 years, there's a cataclysmic event in the church. There's some sort of new reformation, but the old has to die for the new to come. And I do think that as much as we're trying to resist whatever this is, whatever this decline is, and solve the problem, I do wonder if we don't have to sort of, and this is going to sound mysterious and ambiguous, and maybe that's because I don't fully know what I'm saying, but I do think that we may need to ride the wave of death so that we can get to resurrection. In other words, maybe not fight against the decline as much as ask the question, why are we in decline? What's going on? Why have perhaps we've not been faithful in the ways that we've needed to be faithful? There are increasing number of young people who look at the church and they see hypocrisy all over the place, right? And so they call themselves spiritual but not religious, and they walk away from the church and they have their own kind of private relationship with Jesus. And I want to say, instead of demonizing them, why don't we ask, so what happened? When you came to church, what struck you as missing or inauthentic or tough to bear? And so we're constantly in fighter mode, I think. How do we preserve what we've got? And so I can say this because I'm a therapist. The best work that I do with people is when they give up fighting so hard and trying so hard, and they just sort of surrender to the death that Jesus is orchestrating in their lives. And it's sort of like, oh, now I get to grieve and surrender. And out of that, God brings new life and new hope. And so I'm not trying to be a downer here, but I am trying to think at a higher level, at a larger perspective, what needs to happen for us to get to that place that you're talking about.
Yeah. Would it almost be, even I think Henry Nouwen uses this language, an invitation, that this could be an invitation to die to old ways, yes, so that new things can be resurrected.
Yeah.
Some of those things that we need to die to, would you agree, are those old definitions of successive ministry, those old ways of thinking and doing things?
Yeah. Yeah. Those old definitions, that old sense of what it meant for us to be really, to be powerful or to be successful or even to be fruitful. Yeah. It's tough because I will work with an organization and I'll hear people within an organization that is narcissistic say, but the Spirit has blessed this ministry. And I don't want to say, no, the Spirit I don't want to say that at all, but I do want to say that maybe there's more going on than meets the eye. Oftentimes where there are really good things happening and where there is blessing, there's often a shadow side. And I can say that for me in my own life, where people would say, oh, Chuck, you're doing well. You have a good marriage and things seem to be going well in your vocational life and with your kids. I'm like, you don't know my whole story. You don't know the pain in my life. You don't know the shadow side. You don't know the secrets that I hold in my heart, the shame that I deal with. People don't know that after this podcast, I'll be thinking, man, that was dumb. Why did I say it that way? I could have done it so much differently. Maybe I should call up Mark and ask if we could do it. I guarantee you that will happen. And so if we can just acknowledge that kind of shadow side of our our churches, our organizations, our nation, our own selves.
Yeah. That would be an absolute revolution, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
you get a bunch of pastors in a room, and it's just almost a one-upsmanship of
Yeah,
who's bigger and better, and that would
yeah,
just be a revolution.
yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
But I do think it's scary. It's really scary, and I want to acknowledge that when I say that, I have the privilege of saying that, by the way, as someone who sits in an office surrounded by books now. I often say that I was a pastor for a long time, but now I'm like the announcer in the booth who gets to comment on pastors, And so it's easy for me to say, because it's not like my church is declining, or
Hmm.
I'm struggling with polarization and people leaving because they can't agree with that faction in the church or that faction. So it's tough. And I want to acknowledge that really real pain.
Yeah. And even though that's scary, would you agree that there's a lot of church leaders, and they might not put this kind of language to it, they want to be free from
Yeah.
this constant burden of putting out this false self, carrying the weight of this has got to grow bigger this year than last year. That they might not say it, but they want to be free.
I think you're exactly right. I think they want to be free. And I think that sometimes they just don't know how to be free, or the pathway to become free. And I think we're all looking for a quicker way to do it, like a microwavable recipe for freedom. And I don't think that that's possible. I do think that I was talking to a pastor the other day who said to me, it's becoming easier as I see that a number of my peers and colleagues are experiencing some of the same pain that I'm experiencing in this season, and that I'm not alone. That some of the questions that are being asked of me are being asked of them. And so because I'm not as lonely, I feel like I can bear this burden in a way that was harder to bear when I felt lonely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chuck, just to turn the conversation,
Yeah.
with just a few more questions. So
Yeah.
for the person that's listening to this, and they're not a church leader, but they go to a church, and maybe they are seeing some questionable behaviors in a church leader,
Mm-hmm.
but things are moving forward. It's
Yeah.
growing. It seems as if God is blessing, and so that might give them a permission slip to just let the behavior go. I'm sure that it's going to be okay.
Yes.
What would you say to that? What would you say to that kind of church, that person that's in that church, and we're just going to turn a blind eye to it? God's blessing
Yeah.
it.
Oh, that's a good question. So I hear from folks all the time asking that kind of question.
Yeah.
And I'm more and more inclined to say, sit on that. By saying that, I'm not saying don't act. I'm saying sit with that and bring that concern, that sense of incongruency. Yeah, that's the word, I think, that you're seeing in the pastor in the church. Bring that to someone who is trusted in your life, and hopefully someone who knows something about the dynamics of narcissism. And maybe even pick up my book and read it together and say, what am I seeing here that might fit some of what I'm feeling inside? Some of the doubts that I'm having, some of that incongruency. What I've heard a lot of is that people experience this, and their immediate inclination is to sit down with the pastor and say, this is what I'm seeing in the church. And that's almost always a recipe for disaster, if indeed the pastor is on the narcissistic spectrum, because more often than not, you'll get resistance. No. You need to bring that to the Lord. I think that's your own stuff. I think that's kind of what they get. But I think if you bring it to someone who understands, a therapist, a spiritual director, a friend, you work through it a little bit, you might be able to think a bit more strategically about how you might want to engage this. Maybe you want to invite an elder into the conversation. There are other strategies for doing this, and I kind of go case by case with each and every one of them. But what you want to avoid doing is kind of throwing a grenade into the middle of the church and saying, he's a narcissist, I know it. And if you do that, don't blame me.
Yeah, that's right. Because I thought one of the most powerful sections in the book was when you talk about that it's possible to build a system in the church that protects and actually breeds almost narcissism.
Yes,
Right?
that's exactly it. I think what ends up happening is that narcissists will attract what we call ideal hungry followers. In other words, what a follower of a narcissist sees is through the eyes of the narcissist, they see what's missing in them and they plug into them sort of like as a power source, as a battery source for the strength that they think that they need. I feel a little bit better about myself when I'm around him. I feel more purposeful when I'm a part of this organization, whatever it might be. And so you begin to experience a kind of collective narcissism where it's actually within the system. And I saw this a number of years ago when I worked with a church where they identified a narcissistic leader and eventually got that leader to leave, but a lot of the dynamics were still there. And they woke up one day and it was like, oh, so we cleansed the system of the narcissistic leader, but now we have to deal with the rest of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say to the person that's listening, they're watching, and they're not a church leader, or maybe they have influence in the church, but everything that you have said, Chuck, it sounds like you're identifying our church leader, this person in our church, that, it's not even a possibility. You're talking about us. What would you recommend that they do?
So that's another good question. And I do think it begins probably with a core group of people identifying this, praying about it, going slowly, going patiently, because I do think that there's a tendency to be reactive and to, as I said, throw the grenade into the middle and blow it up, and then things get really messy. And then I think at times it's important to enlist other leaders within the church who can begin to cultivate a conversation in earnest. And at every step along the way, you want to notice if you get resistance. Like if there's a willingness to say, yeah, maybe there is something going on here, even from the pastor, that's a good sign. But if there's resistance, that's trouble. Mm-hmm. There are times when churches need to bring in, a third party, some independent consultant, someone like that to work with them. But it's about cultivating an honest conversation. And if there's a willingness to cultivate a 360-degree honest conversation where there's feedback given all the way around, I've seen churches be able to deal with this fairly well. I think there are some exceptions. I think there are exceptions in the cases where that a pastor is abusing his or her power, abusing children, sexually abusing people in the congregation. You have to sound the alarm at that point.
Absolutely.
But I do think that there are situations where maybe there's just a sense of there's something off here, and maybe it just involves bringing in some others. I like the language of non-anxious leadership. I think when that kind of conversation is done in a non-anxious way, not to get him, not to scapegoat her, not to take down the senior pastor, but to say, hey, can we have a unhurried conversation about where we are as a church and how I'm experiencing leadership right now? It could just be that the senior leader's just in a very anxious season. He or she isn't narcissistic, but she's just really anxious right now, and it's coming out in ways that are pushing up against some sensitivities in your own heart. And so cultivate that conversation.
Yeah. And what would you say to the church leader that is listening and maybe they've just had a moment of self-awareness?
Yeah.
They've said, I've never realized everything I've been motivated out of ego, comparison, that this is new language for them.
Yeah.
What would you say to them?
So thank you. I'd say thank you. First of all, I think that's, if you listen to this conversation between Mark and I, and experience some humility, maybe even some shame, humiliation, like, oh goodness, is that me? That's a good sign that you've got a beating heart inside that cares about what's going on in your own soul, your own life, perhaps in your marriage, in your relationships, in your congregation. And it might be worth having a conversation with a friend, a therapist, someone like that to say, hey, I'd just like to take a look at this and ask some diagnostic questions around my leadership, how people experienced me. One of the best questions a leader can ask is, how do you experience me?
Wow.
At the same time, I think that there are those who listen and automatically think, if they're talking about something bad, it's got to be about me, because they are fundamentally more shame-based. So maybe I am a narcissist, and maybe next week you're having a conversation about depression. Maybe I am depressed. Next week you're having a conversation about bipolar disorder. Maybe I am bipolar. And that's yet another conversation to have with someone who maybe knows a little bit more than you do about these kinds of things. But I'd say don't be afraid to find a wise spiritual mentor, director, therapist who can ask really good diagnostic questions. And they're out there. There are really good women and men out there who are willing to sit with you and really attend to your heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Chuck, I'm so thankful that you took the time to have this conversation. I think this is such an important topic that church leaders need to think about more, needs to be talked about more. Chuck, if somebody watching this, they're listening to this, they wanted to get in touch with you, wanted to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So the best contact is chuckdegroat.net. That's my website. And that talks about some of what I do. And one of the things I would say is every time I do these, there are folks who email and say, hey, would you be my counselor, or would you consult for my church? And I'll just say at the outset, I really focus on doing intensive counseling. That's more of a 5-day process with folks. I'm doing less consulting and less individual counseling these days because I'm really trying to kind of hone what I do. But I've got some really good resources and really good references and some friends who do this kind of work and do it really well. So chuckdegroat.net, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. And you're on Twitter as well, right?
I'm on Twitter at chuckdegroat. Yep. All
right. Well, the book is When Narcissism Comes to Church. Chuck, thank you so much for being on the Churchology podcast.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for asking such good questions and serving the church so well by doing a really good podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.